Hello and welcome to the Howell Library. My name is Jenny. I work with the Adult Services team, and we are very happy today to have Rod Sadler discuss his book, Depraved Obsession. So, just a heads up that this is also being live streamed. None of you are visible. Uh, but if you have questions, you can repeat them into the microphone so that the people watching online can hear. Then we'll be good to go. Rod Sadler.
That work? Okay. All right. Hey, thanks. Got some special friends here. Got my wife in the back. Yeah. So I promised for dinner. So, so- anyway, uh, but I went with To Hell I Must Go, which is actually trying to get here a little ditty that the murderess sang in jail. So my second book is called A Slayer Waits, and that's about a murder in Stockbridge, in the southeast corner of Ingham County in 1955. An elderly couple was bludgeoned to death by an escaped convict from Jackson prison. And he was captured about a year later and immediately sentenced to life term at Jackson prison. And his case, he began to appeal his case, and his case languished in the courts until 1984, 29 years, when it was supposed to be heard by the United States Supreme Court. And the Michigan Attorney General's office was quite concerned uh, that the killer was going to get out of prison on a technicality. And I can't tell you the end of the book, then you won't want to read it. So my third book, I do have copies of this here, called Killing Women. And I always tell the audience, this is not a how-to. Okay. Usually there's a chuckle there, but it's a rough crowd today. Yeah, come on, loosen up. Anyway, that's about East Lansing serial killer Don Miller. And if you're not familiar with Don Miller, back in the mid '70s, Don Miller murdered 4 women in Ingham County, East Lansing, and he hid their bodies around the Eaton, Ingham, Clinton area, spread across 3 counties, and only one of those victims had been found. The 3 were still missing. Miller was eventually caught when he broke into a home in Delta Township and raped in Eaton County and raped a 14-year-old girl and was in the process of making her victim number 5. Her brother interrupted the assault, which allowed her to escape and get help. Her and her brother both survived brutal murder attempt. And Miller went to trial for assaulting those kids. He was the prime suspect in the disappearance of those 4 women. And so after he was convicted in the assault on the kids, his attorney came up with a plea deal because he was now facing 2 counts of second-degree murder because the grand jury had been impaneled and indicted him in 2 of the 4 missing, 2 of the 3 missing. And so the plea deal was if Miller would lead authorities to the bodies, then they would reduce the second-degree murder charges that he was facing to manslaughter. He could plead guilty to those and do his time at the same time that he was serving for assaulting children. Kind of convoluted, if you're following me here. Who wouldn't take that deal? So he did. By the late 90s, Don Miller was ready to get out of prison because we didn't have truth in sentencing back then. Truth in sentencing means that if my friend Pat here is arrested for armed robbery and he gets sentenced to 5 to 10 years, he has to do that minimum of 5 years. Back in the late 90s, we didn't have that in Michigan. And so Miller was ready to get out of prison. And so there was a committee that was formed solely to keep him in prison, find a way to keep him in prison. And they discovered 3 years before that, Don Miller had been caught with a garrote in his prison. And if you're not familiar with what a garrote is, it's a strangulation device, strictly an offensive weapon. And so they charged him with possessing a dangerous weapon in the prison in Chippewa County. And he was convicted in that, and he got an additional 20 to 40 years. The reason that I go through all that is I need you to understand I wrote that book for one reason only. People have forgotten who Don Miller is. People have forgotten what Don Miller did. And people need to know that in 2031, Don Miller will be released from prison. He will have served all of his. He's only in prison right now for possessing a dangerous weapon. He's already served his time for the manslaughter that he pled guilty to. So that's why we're interesting side note is that, well, I'll ask you this. How do you start a letter to a serial killer? Anybody? Nobody ever raises their hand. Well, there is one now. Was someone else's turn at? For takes the next exit, jumps on the service road, comes back up, and by that time, the vehicle's gone. All that's left is a 10-speed bike with a can on, A&W, tucked under the seat. So he knows, I've got to get a hold of the police. He goes up to the exit where the pumpkin pantry party store is, and he stops, and lo and behold, right across the intersection is an unmarked Green Oak Township police vehicle with an officer in it. So he starts flashing his lights, and he gets the officer's attention. Dave Ostrom. Did you know Dave? He's been around for years. You knew Dave? Yeah, he's a good friend. So he gets Dave's attention. Dave pulls up next to him, and he says, I think I just saw a kidnapping. So Dave starts taking down information, very detailed information. And as he's putting it out over the radio for other units, just a mile north of there, actually right in front of the state police post, is Livingston County Detective Ed Moore. And Ed Moore hears what's going on. He's a detective, but he's working in uniform that particular day because it's the holiday weekend and he's getting overtime pay. So he's out taking Marine calls, people that are complaining about police. So he hears the kidnapping call, and he gets on the radio. He calls Ostrom, and he says, hey, is anybody at the scene yet? Ostrom says no. So Ed Moore shoots down to the scene where the kidnapping occurred, and all he finds is a 10-speed bicycle. They really don't know what they have at that point. Is it a father disciplining a son? You know, is it a kidnapping? What exactly do they have there? Well, the first thing they do is they call a tracking dog, figuring if it is a kidnapping and the kid got away, he could be out in the field. And so they search the field, nothing. They get a crime scene guy there from the sheriff's office, and they process it as a crime scene. In the meantime, Sean hasn't showed up back home, and his brother gets quite worried. So his brother gets in his car and turns on out of the subdivision onto Whitmore Lake Road. As he's going northbound, he sees a bunch of police cars pulled up. And he says to the officer, hey, I think that's my brother's bike. And so the officer, it was a trooper, points him over to Ostrom. And he says to Dave Ostrom, he says, that's my brother's bike. There must have been an accident. And Ostrom says, why do you think there was an accident? He said, well, you're all here. My brother's bike is there. And so Ostrom has to explain to him, no, it looks like your brother's been kidnapped. So that begins the investigation. On Monday, this was on a Sunday. On Monday morning, the original officers meet with the sheriff and the troopers at MSP. And by Tuesday, and they begin interviewing people. By Tuesday, they have formed a task force. 50 to 75 detectives and officers from around mid-Michigan. They take over an old bank across from the MSP post in Brighton that's just sitting abandoned. They have the command post from MSP come down, and there is a joint effort between local, state, federal agencies, which literally is unheard of. Very seldom do you get that kind of cooperation. Back in the mid-'80s, and I think you can attest to this, agencies had a tendency to kind of hold information real close. They didn't want to share it because they wanted the glory of the arrest. So there was territorial, not disputes, but everybody was territorial. In this case, everybody came together and worked together. So they've got this task force. And the original witness who was driving south that took the exit, he reported the kidnapping vehicle, the kidnapper's vehicle, as a GMC pickup with a cap. And police figured, Well, he's a security guard at DNC. He must be right. I mean, he knows his vehicles. Well, there was another witness that they didn't find out about until 2 days later. She was coming up on Whitmore Lake, so she was even closer than the original witness. And she saw Sean riding like this, looking over his shoulder. And when she did see his face, she could tell he was terrified. And she saw in her mirror the guy forcing him toward a 1985. Completely different than a GMC pickup. So when she gave that information to the investigators on the task force, they took her immediately to an AMC dealership, American Motors Corporation. She went right to a Jeep Renegade, the same color, same make, same model, and said, just like this, and I'm absolutely certain that my boyfriend had it just like this. So for 2 days, police have been searching for the wrong vehicle. They've been searching for it. Now they know they're searching for a 1985 Jeep Renegade. The first thing they do is they get a hold of American Motors Corporation, who manufactured the Jeep. And they got a list for Macomb, Wayne, and Oakland County, all the Jeeps that had been sold between 1980 and 1985. And they had the vehicle identification numbers, all that AMC could provide. So what they did was task force, each member was assigned a number of VINs, and they would have to run that VIN through the Law Enforcement Information Network, find out who the owner was, and then contact the owner and say, where were you on Labor Day weekend with your Jeep? In the middle of all that was a guy by the name of Ron Bailey, Ronald Lloyd Bailey from Livonia. He was just another name on the list. So the police went and they interviewed Ron Bailey, and Ron Bailey said, yeah, I've got a 1985. But he said, I was up in Caseville, which if you're looking at Michigan, yeah, like this. You don't know where Caseville is. It's on Saginaw Bay in the summer. Am I right? Yeah. And he said, I was up there with my friend so-and-so. And so police took down his information. Okay, we'll have an investigator contact you down the road to verify it. That night at task force headquarters, an FBI agent by the name of Jess Lopez was working task force, because it was open 24/7. And the phone rings. Jess Lopez answers the phone. He's with the FBI. And it's the Livonia Police Department. The Livonia Police Department says, hey, we've got this guy that lives in our jurisdiction. His name's Ron Bailey. We have a notebook case against him where he snatches boys off their bikes and sexually assaults them. And you really need to take a look at this guy. So Jess Lopez says, let's go find him right now at 11 o'clock at night. And so they do. They go down to Livonia, and they go to Ron Bailey's house, where he lives with his parents. Mr. Bailey says, Ron's not here right now. He's over at a friend's house at a party. So they leave a card. Have him call us when he gets home. And so they close, Bailey closes the door, and Jess Lopez says, let's go to the party. So they drive over to where the party is, and lo and behold, Bailey's Jeep is there. So they wait. Finally, Ron Bailey comes out, gets into his Jeep, and starts to leave. And they pull a traffic stop on him. And he's indignant. He jumps out. He's waving a business card from whoever interviewed him earlier in the day. Says, I've already talked to the police. I talked to so-and-so. I've made my statement. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So Lopez says, hey, we're not accusing you. We just want to verify your story. Why don't you come on back to the Livonia Police Department? So he does. Goes back. What Ron Bailey doesn't know is that the police are smarter than he thinks they are. And they have find somebody to go talk to his friend. Yeah, was Ron Bailey with you on Labor Day weekend in Caseville fishing? Absolutely not. No, he was not with me. He wanted me to lie for him. So they've got him in a lie. They sit him down at the Livonia Police Department, and again, he's very indignant that they're wasting his time and that he's already talked to somebody. And they decide after interviewing him, because he won't break his story. They confront him with his lie that his friend said, hey, he wasn't up to Caseville with me. And so what they decide to do now in the middle of the night, let's get a hold of the witnesses first thing in the morning. And we'll do a line, see if anybody can pick it. Ron Bailey, they provide him with a public defender. And the public defender chats with him for 2 hours. And I'm sure Ron Bailey would smoke up his rear end. And must be the attorney convinced him, hey, do the line. So they did, but nobody could pick him up. None of the witnesses could pick him up. And so they have to release him. They have to release him. But what they did was when they initially took him into custody and detained him, they searched his wallet, took all of his property away from him. So basically, he was in custody that night. And they go through his wallet, they photograph everything. And then they release him. But what Bailey doesn't know is they've assigned a surveillance team to follow him. In the meantime, Lopez looks through the stuff from the wallet, and he finds a receipt for a record. Oh. And so he tracks down towing. And he says, what's this from? Oh, we pulled a Jeep out. He was four-wheeling somewhere. Nothing special. I said, did you know that? No, didn't know him, but we recognized the passenger. It was Deb Chesney. They knew her from something. So Jess Lopez goes downriver to Detroit, finds Deb Chesney, Ron Bailey's pseudo girlfriend. Ron Bailey is gay, and he's got a girlfriend to cover his sexual prowess. So they talk to Deb Chesney, and Deb Chesney says, yeah, Ron Bailey's my boyfriend. And they said, well, where was he on Labor Day weekend? She said, he borrowed the key to our family cabin in Gladwin. He was going to go up there. He was going to prepare the cabin for deer hunting season and get the lawn. Jess Lopez knew immediately where they'd find him. So Jess Lopez leaves there, gets on a plane with a couple other FBI agents and a couple troopers, and they fly up to Gladwin. And they search the cabin with permission to search from the Chesneys. They don't find a body. They don't find really anything of real evidentiary value. I think they took a pop can and some cigarette butts and stuff like that. And by 6 o'clock, they're landing back in Livingston County. By that time, Ron Bailey, who still doesn't know he's being tailed, he's gone to a couple bars, and suddenly he calls a cab, has him drop him off at Metro Airport, because back then, 1985, you could actually buy a plane ticket without identification and with cash. You can't do that. So he buys a ticket to Orlando, Florida. And as he walks away from the counter, the surveillance guys walk up and say, where's he going? Orlando. Okay. So somebody at the task force, and I don't know who it was, but somebody in the task force had a contact with Tom Monahan of the Detroit Tigers and Domino's Pizza. Usually I say Little Caesars Pizza, then I gotta go, oh, oops, no, Domino's. Tom Monahan donated his jet to the surveillance team and his pilot, and the surveillance team flew to Florida and beat the commercial flight down because they had a layover in Atlanta. Sure enough, Ron Bailey gets to Orlando, Florida, and he beds down for the night at the Days Inn. And then the next morning, the surveillance team is following him. He gets on a bus. So does one of the guys from the surveillance team. He doesn't know where he's going, but he's on the bus with Ron Bailey. Sits a couple seats behind him on the opposite side, just to keep an eye on him. The rest of the surveillance team tail the bus. They get down to Bellevue, Florida, which is south of Ocala. And Ron Bailey beds down in kind of a rundown trailer park. And they don't have the ability to keep a constant eye on him because of the surroundings, so they have a limited surveillance. In the meantime, back in Michigan, search has been organized in Gladwin County by the task force. And they've got troopers and detectives from all over the state coming in to help search the area for Sean Williams. And there was a trooper from Pontiac who had a partner, and they were assigned an area in Section 32 of Gladwin County. It was about 3 miles from the cabin. The cabin was on what they called Mosquito Truck Trail, kind of a slang term. The road actually had real. But anyway, about 3 miles away, these guys were set to begin their search. They had the Livingston County as chief assistant prosecutor up there. They set him up on at a table. They ran a phone line from a telephone pole down to a phone in case they needed a search warrant or something. And so he was sitting out in the open there at a card table, I guess. And these guys down the road, about 3 miles, they saw some tracks going back into the woods. And y'all have been to northern Michigan. Probably you know those dirt, sandy roads and sand along the side and all the ferns and stuff. Well, they saw some birds circling. The one says to the other guy, "What kind of birds?" They walked in about 75 feet, and they found Sean's body. Word was relayed to the surveillance team in Florida that prosecuting attorney's office in Livingston County now felt they had him charged Bailey with at least kidnapping. And then when an autopsy was done on Saturday, they would charge him with the murder. So go ahead and move into the trailer and arrest him in Florida, in Bellevue, Florida. So they did. Except Ron Bailey was gone. He snuck out. He didn't know, at least they didn't think he knew, that he was being tailed. But obviously, he did. So he'd snuck out the back. For 3 days, in a 10-square-mile area, they had horses, ATVs, helicopters, airplanes, people on foot, police cars every 500 feet around this 10-square-mile area looking for Ron Bailey. This went on for 2 days, 3 days, and just getting into the third night when a corrections officer who volunteered her own time off duty to help search for him swings her flashlight over right at dusk and catches a guy right at a fence line. And he throws his hands up and says, "I'm Ron Bailey, tired, I'm hungry." And they arrest him. Back in Michigan, Ron Bailey's sister was taking business law classes. And she was aware of everything that was going on. And so she went up and she talked to her instructor, a guy by the name of Ray Sadler. He was a very, very young attorney out of Farmington Hills. Had only been practicing law for a year and was trying to supplement his limited income with by being a part-time instructor at Williamston. And so she went up to him and said, "I don't know if you're familiar. My brother, would you take the case?" Ray Cassar said, "Sure." Well, Ray didn't have a lot of experience, so he brought his colleague, a guy that he shared a building who had about 10 years of criminal law experience. And so the two of them got a phone call from a guy who said, "Let's meet." He said, "But we can't meet in public. We have to meet at your office." Well, the guy that called was a guy by the name of Jose Thompson. He was Ron Bailey's psychiatrist. Ron Bailey's background started really in about 1973 when he started kidnapping little boys. In 1976, Ron Bailey kidnapped a young boy, sexually assaulted him, choked him out to the point where he thought that he had killed him, and threw his body in the ocean. And he was charged in that. He was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder at the age of 16. And when that case was resolved, the judge had a decision to make. Should I sentence him to prison, or should I confine him to the Hawthorne Psychiatric Hospital for youth, as opposed to the North? And the judge, having a very difficult decision, knew that Ron Bailey would get no help in prison, but could get help maybe rehabilitation. So at the age of 16, he was confined there. And he went through counseling sessions with his parents and things like that. And his doctor, the whole time he was there, was a guy named Dr. Jose. And then when Bailey turned 18, he was confined to the Northville Regional Psychiatric Hospital under the care of Dr. Jose. So that's where Dr. Tombo came into this picture. And he contacted Ray Cassar, sets up this clandestine meeting at Ray's office. This is just before Bailey gets caught in Florida. So he sets up this meeting, and it's Ray Cassar, Chuck Murphy, Alfred Bailey, Ron's dad, and Dr. Tombo. Dr. Tombo's a little Filipino guy. Comes in, and he says to the three others, he says, "I can give you everything that you need to show that Ron Bailey was insane, kidnapped and murdered people. I've got all his records. There's one caveat. That is, cannot mention the fact that I checked him out of the house, took him across the border into Canada to the horse races." Ron Bailey's dad had been told by Ron that Dr. Tombo had done sexually assaulted. And Ron Bailey's dad hadn't believed his own son. But when Dr. Tombo said that, came unglued. Mr. Bailey came unglued. He was killed. He was going to die. Ray Cassar and Chuck Murphy had to step in between them and say, "This is not the time or place. We'll get this worked out." Now, Alfred Bailey knew everything that Ron had told him was true about that. So when Tombo left that meeting, Ray Cassar and Chuck Murphy knew they'd probably never see him again. They were right. They tried serving him subpoenas for trial, and Tombo was nowhere to be found. They hired private investigators. Nobody could find him. So they surmised that he was probably being concealed by the Filipino until after the trial. So Dr. Tombo never testified. Bailey comes back. They bring him back to Michigan. And Ray Kassar says to him at the Williamston County, he says, there's something I need. Is there anybody else? Meaning, is there other people? And Ron Bailey says, no other evidence. Well, this is getting a lot of press, and the Ferndale police take notice because a year before Ron Bailey was accused of kidnapping Sean Moore, in June of 1984, a little boy by the name of Kenny Meyer came up missing in Ferndale. His body was found in Hines Park, just outside of Westland, the next day. And he had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Same MO as Ron Bailey. Now, in the Sean Moore case, Dr. Larry Simpson from Sparrow Hospital could not determine a cause of death because of decomposition. But what he did determine was that in the lab work that Sean Moore had a highly elevated amount of antihistamine in his system, much more than the therapeutic level for a 13-year-old boy. And that also followed along would be to ply his victims with alcohol and or some sort of antihistamine type drug that would make the resistant. So Dr. Simpson, when he did the autopsy, though he could not determine a cause of death, the manner of death was homicide, taking in all of the totality of the circumstance, kidnapping, the elevated system of antihistamine system, the fact that it wasn't suicide, wasn't so Ferndale police is looking at him, and they're able to charge Ron Bailey in Kenny Meyer's kidnapping and murder a year before Sean Moore. So now he's facing two counts, two courts. The charges are kidnapping and murder and sexual assault. And then they determined that a month before Kenny Myers was kidnapped, Ron Bailey had kidnapped a 16-year-old boy from the mall in Dearborn Heights and sexually assaulted that boy, but let him go. So that boy was able to pick him out. So now he's facing a third court charge of kidnapping and sexual assault. So Ron Bailey's case goes to trial. And the state's expert, a guy by the name of Dr. Harley Stock, you probably remember his name, from the Don Miller case. He was the state's prosecution expert, or psychiatry expert. Anyway, Dr. Stock was contacted by an agency in Sylvania, Ohio, who said they have a similar case down there where they had a teen who was found strangled, who had been plied with alcohol, and the case had gone cold. And so they wondered if Dr. Stock would maybe see if Ron Bailey was involved when he interviewed him, because Ron Bailey's defense was insanity. So with the insanity defense, he was sent to the Ypsilanti, to the state hospital there, where he was interviewed ad nauseum by Dr. Harley Stock and Dr. Lynn Blunt. And the Sylvania police asked if he would interview Ron Bailey about this murder they had. course, Ron Bailey completely denied it. Said he had nothing to do with it, but did make a statement in his court trial that he had actually stayed in Sylvania. So, Ron Bailey's case goes to trial, and Ray Kassar and Chuck Murphy did the best they could with what they had. Ray Kassar was a very genuine, I think he's a very genuine person. I interviewed him for the book. He really felt that Ron Bailey wasn't a monster, that he was simply misguided and needed help, that he was sick. I disagree. I think Ron Bailey's a monster. But Ray Kassar was very nice. They couldn't find a psychiatrist who would testify with the defense. Everybody turned the case down. It would have been career suicide for them to take a case like that, simply because it involved a child. So one day, Sandy, you might remember this, there was a guy that worked in the Detroit area, a psychiatrist, and he was like, well, you guys are close enough. Terry Hanks, he was like Terry Hanks from Sundance Chevy. He had on commercials every day, all hours of the day, advertising his psychiatric services. Very charismatic, very narcissistic, and everybody in the Detroit area knew who he was. He called up Ray Kassar one day, and he said, I'll take the case. And he said, I won't even work for expert fees. I'll work for whatever the defense fee is. State. So he was working for next to nothing. It was probably $20 an hour at that, because I think it's only $40 an hour today. But anyway, he takes the case for the notoriety. Okay, get his name out there a little bit. They crucify him. He's the worst. He editorialized everything, went on, confused the jury completely. Nobody could understand what he was talking about. They complained at the end that they were there to determine innocence or guilt, not to watch the Joel Dreyer show. That's what they considered that. He was a narcissistic guy that's doing press. And so the jury found Ron Bailey guilty of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder here in Livingston County. The jury found him guilty, and then he had a trial in Wayne County for kidnapping and murder of Kenny Myers. And in that case, he chose a bench trial. And as soon as that trial was over, if you don't know what a bench trial is, trial before the judge. He hears all the evidence and makes the guilty or not guilty. And so the judge, at the end of the trial, said, we'll take a short recess for 17 minutes. And he came right back in and said, guilty of Kenny Myers' kidnapping. In the third case, the young man that was kidnapped a month before Kenny Myers, they decided that would just be cumulative. Bailey was already facing 2 life sentences for Kenny Myers and Sean Moore's murder, so they dismissed that third case. It's really a sad case. I think Ron Bailey is despicable. I think Ray Kassar would disagree, but he would do so in a very professional way. It's important for people to understand when you're reading Depraved Obsession that it's not a book about the murder. It's really the story of how law enforcement came together in a time that was unheard of for them to do that, to find this killer. They still had the Oakland County child killings on their mind. Everybody's familiar with those, right? Anybody not? I'll give you a brief synopsis. Okay, everybody's familiar with them. Still unsolved. This book is not about the Oakland County child. But I do open the book, chapter 1, describing the Oakland County child. And the reason that I do that is when I started researching this book, I thought, well, gosh, this was 1985. In 1976, when Mark Stebbins, the first Oakland County child victim, came up missing, Ron Bailey was like 17 years old. Maybe he's involved. That's what my thought was. And so as I got into doing the research, I was talking to some of the investigators and some of the prosecuting attorneys and things like that. And they were saying, no, Ron Bailey, way too young to be involved. He was probably riding on training wheels. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, he was 17 years old. So I read a book called The Snow Killer. Have you read that? It's about the Oakland County child killer. Okay. It's really interesting. And it mentions that they talked to Ron Bailey about the Oakland County child killer. And so I contacted one of the investigators who became part of the task force when the Oakland County child killing investigation was reopened in 2006, 30 years after Mark Stebbins came up. And he said in the Oakland County child killings, a lot of the evidence seemed to have been misplaced or lost. So he was part of a couple officers that went from crime lab to crime lab to crime lab, trying to find that evidence. And they were able to locate 3 pieces of forensic evidence in that case. This is literally the last chapter of the book. And those 3 pieces of forensic evidence were 3 hairs. After Mark Stebbins came up missing in 1976, the Southfield Police Department interviewed a pedophile by the name of Arch Sloan. And Arch Sloan allowed them to search his vehicle. So they took some forensic evidence from that vehicle. And part of that was a hair, or a group of hairs. But one hair in particular stood out as human. And when Mark Stebbins' body was found, they took a hair off Mark Stebbins' body. And 18 months later, when Timothy King's body was found, they took a hair off Timothy King's body. All 3 of those hairs came from the same person. Okay? That's how they know those cases are packed in. In addition, there was 2 young teenage girls who were also connected between Mark Stebbins. So the hairs didn't match Arch Sloan. They didn't match any of the other suspects that the Oakland County Child Killing Task Force had come up with. And so finally they said, let's go talk to Ron Bailey. So they did. And they went under the guise of, we're here, we're going to reopen the case against Dr. Combo, him molesting patients, and we just want your story. So Bailey was singing like a bird. The second time they went, they said, we're here for your DNA. I'm going to pause that for just a second to tell you that Ray Kassar gave me a bunch of newspaper articles that he had collected over the years about the case for me to use as research. And then Jack Kresnak, who wrote for covered the story in the Detroit Free Press, gave me a big sack of his notes that he had taken. And both those guys had received a card from Ron Bailey from prison, like a, hey, hope you're doing well, Merry Christmas, whatever. Ron Bailey's handwriting, absolutely. For somebody that writes in person, it's absolutely perfect writing. And the reason that I tell you that is when this investigator and another one from the state police went up and interviewed him the second time, they said, we want your DNA. He said, what do you want my DNA for? And they said, we're going to compare it with the Oakland County child killing cases. Apparently, Ron Bailey's handwriting he was so frustrated, or so flustered, that he could barely write his name. Permission to give his DNA. I think that's compelling. And so they took it, and sadly, it didn't match. But the pretext for the Oakland County child killing, or the assumption for the Oakland County child killings, has always been that it was not a single person responsible for those kidnappings. It was a group of people, group of pedophiles. And that they could have used a lure to get the kids close, okay? So that the kidnappers could grab them. Ron Bailey, at 17 years old, looked like he was about 13. Straight blonde hair, blue eyes, thin build. Could Ron Bailey have been the lure? I asked the investigator that. And he said he absolutely thinks that Ron Bailey could have had some part in the Oakland County child. Ron Bailey will never get out of prison, and he'll never admit to anything else that he's done. But I can tell you, when he moved to Florida in the early 80s, after he got off, he was still on probation. He started doing the same thing in Florida that he was doing up here, kidnapping boys. And when the heat got turned on down there, he fled back up here. So the question remains, are there other victims out there? I believe there are. So let's do, it's 3 o'clock, let's do a Q&A. And you can ask me, let me tell you about, before, if you got some questions about Depraved Obsession, hold on one second. I just want to tell you a breaking news on the unsolved murder from 1960. I got an email from a guy in North Carolina in March of this year. The book was published in 2023. So a year and a half later, I get an email, and the subject line just says DNA. And the body of the report doesn't say, "Dear Mr. Sadler, dear author, hi, how are you?" It just simply says, "I need to talk to you." Okay? So I make contact with this guy, and he says he thinks his grandfather committed the murder. And I said, "Well, what makes you think that?" He said, "Well, my grandfather was a con." He said, "I didn't know him very well because I was just young." But he said he died in 1975. But every summer he would go to Mackinac Island, and he would run scams on tourists. And he led kind of a double life. He might have had a family up in he said, "But I heard about your book on a podcast." And he said the hair stood up on him. He said, "I know he did." And I said, "Well, do you have anything more definitive?" And he said, "Well, after 1960, he didn't know." Okay. Anything else? He said, "Well, somewhere in the family, there's a letter that leads to the murder of a woman." Now he's got my attention. So I said, "Well, who's got the letter?" He said, "Well, I have to find it." He said, "But I think my mom's got it." And he was my age, so his mom was home. And so pretty soon he gets a hold of me, and he sends me the letter. He doesn't send me a copy of it. He says, "We have no use for this. Here, it's yours." So I now have the letter. And the letter says, "Dear EJ," he's writing to his brother. It says, "Dear EJ, I'm under fire for murder here." He says, "I'm not in jail yet. Police think I did. I didn't do it. I don't know anything about it. But I need you to contact the sheriff down there, see if they know that that slut can cause me a lot." Exactly what he said. And he said, "If the sheriff doesn't know anything about what's going on up here, don't say anything, and don't call me back. All the lines are tapped." So I'm thinking, what do we do with this? So I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that the state police have a team of investigators who specialize in what's called scientific content analysis, called the scan. And if my friend Pat was under suspicion of a crime, I would sit down with him as an investigator and say, I want you to write down everything that you did on the date of this crime, from the time you got up to the time you went. And then based on how that is structured and different terms that were used and some other things, I could opine whether or not he was being truthful. And so I thought, if I take this letter from this guy on Mackinac Island, maybe the state police can look at it, they're scanned guys, and opine whether or not this guy's blowing smoke. And so I gave it to him. Well, I gave it. So, and they sent an email back, and they said, well, it doesn't really follow the criteria that we use. It's an open-ended letter. It doesn't follow the specific guidelines we use. But they said there are a couple red flags in it. He said, one, why would he write the letter in the first place if he didn't have anything to do with it? Secondly, he twice denied having any part in the murder, which apparently, for some reason, is a red flag to him. And they said it would be nice to know who the slut is and whether or not the slut was interviewed. So I called the guy back, hey, who's the slut in the letter? And he says, oh, well, that's my grandfather's third wife. I said, okay. So I'm kind of at a loss. I don't know where to go with it from here, but it's certainly interesting. And I didn't mean to go off on a tangent on Grim Paradise, but I always like to tell this story because maybe we could still solve this murder if we could find the evidence. That's the problem in the case, the evidence. So anyway, now I'll do some question and answer. I'm sorry. Oh, there's lots more in there. There's lots more in there. Yeah, I gave you the abridged version. Yes. They moved shortly after they moved out of their house while he was on trial to avoid publicity and such. Mr. Bailey was the only member of the family that would go to the trial. The wife didn't, the kids didn't, and they ended up moving after. And I had heard that, I think I even saw a letter from that his attorney said, even his family. Apparently his brother and sister stayed in touch with him for some time, but don't anymore. Oh yeah, he's back in Michigan. He did his first 6 or 8 years in federal because he was a pedophile who'd murdered kids, and they were concerned for his safety. If you want to read about his first, I highlighted in the book, his first 6 months or maybe a year was at Leavenworth. And there's a book called The Hot House. And the first chapter is about Ron Bailey. And, it's actually about one of the snitches in the prison, but in how he dealt with Ron Bailey. And the names have been changed, but it literally outlines his exact crimes, snatching boys off bikes in Michigan. So it's Ron Bailey. There was even a newspaper on it. So, The Hot House. Yeah. More questions? Come on. I have to give you kind of a long version of this so you understand. I got the 2,000-page police report that I read twice. Very difficult to read because some of it was fading and things like that. Right. And And I didn't tell my wife that it cost me $2,500 until we got our taxes. So anyway, yeah. So I had this police report, and I thought I need a way to track. They literally missed about half a dozen names in there, at least once. So there might have been 6 or 7 names, 2,000 pages, because they redact them. And so I made a spreadsheet, 10-page spreadsheet of the page numbers and what was in this group of pages. And then I would put the name, like, oh, they mentioned Bud Smith. And it was about this. And then I'd put whoever the officer was. And that was a searchable database that I could do a quick, oh, I need to go back to this page. And so when I got that information, I thought, so I started, and I got about 10 pages in. And then I thought, I wonder if they missed his name. Well, lo and behold, they did. On one report from a captain or lieutenant to a captain, he said, we need to re-interview this guy, and it gives his name, because he said something, or because we can't verify his story. That's what it is. And so, and it's based on tip number such and such. So I do my database search, and I find tip such and such and pull up the report. Of course, his name's redacted now. But yeah, they interviewed him. And his story was in 1960. Now, he wrote the letter 2 weeks after Mrs. Lacey's body was found. It was on Grand Hotel stationery. He was a bartender there. And he said that he had gotten off work at like 7 in the morning, went back to the Twilight Inn, which is where apparently Grand Hotel housed their employees. And he went to sleep and slept till 2 o'clock, and he has no one as an alibi. And so he's got no alibi now. And then he shows up again in 1966. He's back on the island, and he's a drunk, and he's spouting off at one of the local bars saying, if somebody pays him enough money, he'll tell him he killed Mrs. Lacey. And so everybody the police talked to the people that reported it, and they said, yeah, he's just a drunk. And so they kind of write him off as the suspect. And that's the last we ever heard of him. Yeah, he died in 75. He's buried back down in North Carolina. It is an MSP case, yeah. So it's a fascinating case, really. I do, at the end of that book, I identify a new suspect, not this guy, but another guy, a serial killer that I could be responsible. A guy by the name of Gerald. That's another long story. I believe he could be involved, and then there's a guy that they arrested November 4th, 1960, and the only reason I mention that date is because that's my birthday. The day I was born, actually, November 4th, 1960. They arrested this guy in Ionia for B&E, and they interviewed him, and they said, what were you doing during the summer? And he said, well, I was on Mackinac Island. Well, red flag, call this a clue in police work, and they contact Detective Sprato up in Marquette. He said, re-interview him, find out, pin him down on when he was on the island. And they went to re-interview him, and he said, oh, I didn't say Mackinac. I meant Fox Island. Yeah, Fox Island. Yeah, well, they sound just alike. So they take a hair from him to compare with Mrs. Lacey, the hairs that were taken off Mrs. Lacey's body, and the laboratory scientist says that he cannot be excluded as a suspect because the hairs from Mrs. Lacey's body and the hair from the known individual could have come from the same. But yet they gave him a polygraph, and he passed, and so they wrote him. Now, if you're in law enforcement, you know that the reason polygraphs aren't admitted in Michigan, part of the reason is because they're not always reliable. People pass them when they shouldn't. And so I'm not a firm believer that that was an accurate copy, especially when he changed his story about being on the island. There, to at least some degree, compared to question. More questions? I do have some books up here available. They're $20 each. I can take cash, check, credit card, shekel, drachma, lira, pesos, but I draw the line at yen. No yen. Thank you very much for having me.